sort of a straw man. So when they described mercantilism, it wasn't always mercantilism as the mercantilists would have described it themselves. They tended to attribute a rather naive version of it, in much the same way as, the zoologist when he's talking about creationism and having a go at religion. You set up the super naive version in order to critique. But these four, Quenet, the sort of founder, the big man of the physiocratic movement in France, so that's roughly 30-odd years before the French Revolution. This was the man who stood up and said, actually, we've got to get agriculture right. We've got to give up on all these sort of tiny little French farms where everybody does their own thing and set up proper agricultural systems like they have in England, which is highly productive. Try and follow the lead which was happening at that stage in Normandy of having big sort of industrial agriculture with all the advantages of the agricultural revolution. Get productivity straight, get rid of all the barriers to trade internally, get rid of government intervention, and basically push the economy into greater efficiency. But achieve the efficiency not by the sort of dirigiste approach that we saw yesterday with the kind of French mercantilists, but rather by having a laissez-faire approach. And he coined the phrase, laissez-faire. Let it be. And he was a physician. Okay? He was court physician at Versailles. He was, the man who was looking after Madame de Pompadour. This was a great job to have. This was a sinecure. And it left him lots of time to think about economics. In Edinburgh, round about the same time, David Hume. Okay? Most people know him as a philosopher. They don't realize how much writing he did on economics. Hume was a profoundly important figure. Also in Edinburgh, Adam Smith, Hume's sort of great buddy, whose first real book on the theory of moral sentiments was explaining how people have to be concerned with each other, and whose second great book, on the wealth of nations, said that actually people should be worrying about themselves. And then David Ricardo, a generation later, who made a potload of money in banking and then took advantage of that to retire, but always remained very well-heeled, sort of super in charge of things, one of the few genuine economists ever to have succeeded in the economy without writing a textbook. So they were the guys who, if you like, stood up and said, the basic notion of mercantilism, the idea that gold and silver matters, is wrong. The notion that you have to have a strong central state which has a consistent trade surplus is wrong. That in fact too much government can be as bad as too little. Okay? They were opposing the very fundamental core of thinking until that time. Okay, so let's have a look at what they had to say. Now, there are four basic approaches, four critiques, if you like, of mercantilism that come from their schools. Okay, so the Physiocrats, Quenet, French group, super opposed to dirigism, and in particular concerned that all these attempts to control the economy were distorting it. That if you would just leave it alone, it'll get better by itself. I mean, he was a doctor. He was doing exactly what every mother tells their child when they're 14 and 15 and worried about their complexion. Don't pick at it and it'll get better. Okay? The response from Hume was slightly different. Hume was going, and looking at the specie flow theory. Okay, now specie, you remember, is gold and silver. And we have his name attached to it, but in actual fact, he was recycling old ideas. Locke had said this years before, and Richard Cantillon, who people often pronounce Cantillon because he was working in France, he was actually Irish, had all come up with this idea beforehand, and as we saw yesterday, Thomas Mann himself, the great mercantilist, was also aware of it. But we'll go into it in some detail. Then Adam Smith, okay, who, if you look at The Wealth of Nations, which is a bit of a tome, book 4 of the Wealth of Nations, which is one of the center points of it, is the critique of bullionism. About a quarter of The Wealth of Nations is taken up with critiquing the mercantilists. And his critique of mercantilism has a variety of components to it. One is the critique of bullionism, of the idea that gold and silver are all that matters, that, if you like, gold and silver are wealth. But the other is, he says, trade is not a zero-sum game. That if you do what you're good at, and I do what I'm good at, and we trade with each other, we both benefit. And that this provides opportunities for specialization in the division of labor, which for him was the source of all wealth. And then lastly, we have Ricardo, who argues that you can have gains from trade even if you don't have what we now call absolute advantage. Even if there's a situation where I can do everything better than you. Okay? Anything you can do, I can do better, and yet we should still trade. Okay? Right, so let's have a look. The Physiocrats. The heart of physiocracy is actually a philosophical point. I mean, it's something that often gets forgotten. The Physiocrats had this notion that there is a natural law that is ideal, and there are man-made laws which should mirror them. And in the natural order of things, people just do what's right. There is a recognition of what the right thing to do is, and the law should merely reinforce it. There's a natural order of trade, and the law should merely support it. There was also a concern that under the sort of dirigiste view of how to run an economy, Colbert had been pushing really hard for the development of manufacturing, and in order to push manufacturing, he had penalized agriculture. And the Physiocrats looked at agriculture and said, what is the difference between farming and manufacturing? Well, they said, a farmer takes seed, which is worth nothing, puts it in the ground, and then sits back and watches while nature does the work. He then harvests and makes money. In other words, nature has a way of adding value without taking into account the labor that goes in. In other words, nature is doing the work for you. Whereas in the manufacturing sector, if nobody does it, nothing happens. Now, there's a fundamental flaw in his logic, okay, but he didn't see it. It took Adam Smith, over the ocean, well, over the English Channel anyway, to spot the hole in the logic. But for the Physiocrats, agriculture was critical. And remember that France at this stage was down and out. Under Louis XIV, France had bankrupted itself. And this expression, pauvre fermier, pauvre royaume, poor farmers, poor kingdom, actually says it all. The farmers were paying all the taxes, and the aristocracy were doing nothing. He suggested that the system of taxation should be replaced by what he called an impôt unique, a single tax. And this was to be a single tax on the land. If the land was the source of value, then you tax the land, not the farmer, but the landlord. And the landlords were all the aristocracy. So his notion, instead of the aristocracy paying no tax, which was the situation, they should be paying all the tax. Was this popular back home at Versailles? No. If they had thought about it, it's one of those sort of what ifs. If they had thought about it seriously, would the revolution have happened? Well, quite possibly not. On the other hand, then we wouldn't have had Napoleon, and we wouldn't have had sort of European legal systems and the decimal system and so on and so on. Who knows, maybe we're better off with the revolution. He felt that in order to achieve this natural system, which would be ideal, you need to get rid of all the things that are in the way. What's in the way? Well, the government, monopolies, rent-seeking, okay, systems of regulation which are set up so that people can try and make money out of them. Basically, any system which allows for sort of people to take a bit on the side here and maybe another bit on the side there and make monopoly profits, that's in the way of efficiency. That's in the way of the natural order. Answer, laissez-faire. What's the role of government? Provide secure property rights, define who owns what, clear rules, and then leave it alone. Laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Now, it was a fairly successful critique of mercantilism, but Smith and Hume and the others felt it didn't go far enough. Okay, so let's have a look at the specie flow approach. Now, remember, specie is gold and silver. Okay, it's bullion. Now, we saw yesterday that Thomas Mann had spotted a problem. He had said, if you're running a persistent trade surplus, your money supply is going to go up, and this is going to cause problems. And what you need to do is to try and find a way of neutralizing that increased money supply. Okay, so his comment, all men do consent that plenty of money in a kingdom doth make the native commodities dearer. Increase the money supply, you get inflation. He had spotted it. Nonetheless, they, in particular Hume, whose name we give to this, had said, look, exports greater than imports, inflow of bullion, rise in the money supply. Money supply goes up, means prices go up, and if your prices are going up, then your exports are less competitive. It's a very simple chain of logic. Remembering that this is a world in which everybody is using gold and silver, so they're using bullion as the basic medium of exchange. So flexible exchange rates don't help any. What's happening is that the amount that you have to pay your workers in order to do a job, because you've got domestic inflation, is going up. Costs are going up. Problems. Okay? In other words, any attempt to run a consistent trade surplus is going to be self-defeating. Is there a way around the problem? Well, first things first, we accepted yesterday that if you have a country with a shortage of cash, then you lack the lubrication to make the cogs of industry go round. Okay, and there are plenty of cases where this has happened. If you look at the history of the southern states of the United States after the Civil War, they went into a major recession because there was a colossal shortage of cash. They'd printed their own notes, and their own notes didn't mean anything anymore. And until Union banknotes had actually moved down into the South, they were in a total mess. Mexico, during the revolution of 1910, same thing. Shortage of cash, and the economy was a total disaster. So in that situation, okay, inflow of cash makes a difference. But what are the other problems? Well, if you have substantial amounts of unemployed resources, if you've got unemployed labor, unemployed land, underemployment in general through the economy, then an increase in the money supply can provide a stimulus. Okay, it needn't cause immediate inflation. It simply generates increased demand and increased output. Increase in money supply, reducing the need for barter and increasing trade. Okay, fine, we've talked about that. One of the things that's sometimes raised is if the demand for your exports is price inelastic, then this shouldn't be a problem. Of course, people respond to that. Well, if the demand for your exports is price inelastic, why haven't you put your prices up already? And then the possibility that we distinguish between tradables and non-tradables, it could be that the tradables are only a small component of your economy. So the inflow of bullion is relatively small relative to the rest of the economy. In other words, the inflation will actually be much less profound than the simple model suggests. Okay, let's try and move on. I mean, Hume was remarkable, and he exchanged large numbers of his ideas with Smith. But what we'll see is that they tend to get subsumed in The Wealth of Nations, and I'm just going to move straight on to it. Okay, so a big chunk of this is now going to be Adam Smith, okay, the man. And most of his comments on mercantilism come from Book 4. I should add, The Wealth of Nations is one of the more readable economics texts that's been written. It made such an impact, despite being something that looks like a telephone directory, because it was so readable. And you could do a whole lot worse sometime than just to pick up a copy and give it a go. And Book 4 is really good. He says, consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only insofar as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. His focus was on the consumer, and he says mercantilism sacrifices the interest of the consumer to that of the producer. We're focusing on exports and saying, the hell with the consumer. And I don't know how many of you have seen Neva Mogetla's little piece in today's electronic media. It's quite interesting that Neva, who's an old-time Marxist, piled in and said, anyone who says, as Julius Malema did, that we need to keep barriers to imports of cheap chickens is forgetting about the consumer. And she gives a long, detailed argument about how in a country where we have large numbers of poor people, cheap chicken has actually been a lifesaver for the low-income portions of the community. It's an interesting little piece, and I recommend it to anyone who's interested. Okay, then he has a go at bullying, and to be honest, he is grossly unfair. Okay, Smith really sets up a straw man here. I mean, he makes out that the mercantilists basically were idiots. And he doesn't give them nearly the credit that he should in most cases, although we'll see that he's actually quite nice about Munn. And in having a go at bullionism, his big point is that money is not a thing in itself. The wealth of a nation for Smith is not the bullion that it has. It's the flow of goods that it can command. A country is rich as if it can command large quantities of goods. It's poor if it can't. And the amount of gold and silver is neither here nor there. It tells us nothing about the relative prices. It tells us nothing about even the availability of the products. So, in fact, he says, money runs after goods. Goods don't run after money. You've got to get the priorities right. People don't want money for its own sake. They want it for the sake of what they can buy with it. Now, he then, like I said, at least acknowledges that Mann had some ideas. And Mann has given this image in his text of gold being like seed for a farmer. That, of those 12 points that he used yesterday, one of them, the 9th, was that you should be prepared to actually send your gold and silver offshore if need be. Okay, don't just hog it. Be prepared to actually use it. For him, he said, it's like seed. It only works if you spread it. And Smith says of Mann's ideas, they were solid, so far as they asserted that the exportation of gold and silver in trade might frequently be advantageous to the country. They were solid too, in asserting that no prohibition could prevent their exportation when private people found any advantage in exporting them. In other words, Mann recognized that if you could make money by exporting gold and silver, then people would be doing it. If the exchange rates had been jimmied, people would find a way of sending cash out the country. The prices find a level is the way we'd think of it now. Okay? Gold and silver will just flow to keep the prices leveled internationally. So he accepts that Mann saw this, but he says Mann's arguments were sophistical. Okay, in other words, in supposing that either to preserve or to augment the quantity of those metals required more the attention of government than to preserve or augment the quantity of any other useful commodity, which the freedom of trade without any such attention never fails. In other words, Mann thought that government had to get involved. And Smith is saying, no, it doesn't. The best government is the least government. Okay, again, laissez-faire. We'll note, incidentally, that Smith ended his days as a collector of customs duties. So he recognized that there was a place. And tomorrow we'll talk about some of the things that Smith was prepared to accept as reasons for having tariffs. He had 3 things that he would accept reasonably. But in general, he felt government should butt out. And again, like the mercantilists, he felt that people should try to be frugal. He advocated parsimony. The essence of mercantilism is telling people to save, and in particular to cut back on consumption of imported luxuries. Because that way we can accumulate gold and silver. And Smith is saying, you should save, you should be frugal. Frugal living is good. He says, just as frugal living is better for the body. Okay, he actually was having a go at doctors. He was saying, if you overindulge, you feel it. So you need to hold back. Go on a diet. It's good for the body. In exactly the same way, it's good for the body of the economy. If people are frugal, then this compensates not only for the private prodigality of individuals, but, and this was his real sort of bête noire, the public extravagance of government. You need a lot of people to save to compensate for the way that government blows money. And what is it that promotes that kind of saving. And for him, you can't have investment, you can't have increased productivity, you can't have growth of an economy unless people are saving. Okay, he isn't into the world of deficit budgeting and stuff like that. Saving is driven by self-interest. It's driven by self-interest, but it benefits the nation. So, does the state have a role? Well, Yarnia. He says, the great object of the political economy of every country is to increase the riches and power of that country. Okay, bang in line with the mercantilists. But, and here's the difference, he says, it ought therefore to give no preference nor superior encouragement to the foreign trade of consumption above the home trade, nor to the carrying trade above either of the other two. In other words, the carrying trade is transport. Okay, so shipping. You should not favor shipping. Navigation laws, favoring English bottoms, out. Exports. Your export sector should be no more valuable to the government than domestic production. You should leave it alone. The function of government, if government wants to increase the riches and power of a country, is to butt out. Okay, so trade for him is not a zero-sum game. And he gives 4 reasons. The biggest of them comes in his notion of the division of labor. Now, Smith's ideas on the division of labor, when we first see them, feel a bit odd. He talks about everybody having a desire for truck, okay, for trucking. For everybody, he says, has this innate desire to bargain with everybody else. Which is absolute bunk. And then he says, in addition to the propensity to truck and barter, we have the division of labor and specialization. He's picking up on something that Plato and Aristotle had picked up on far long before. I mean, Aristotle has a beautiful section on actually how specialization took place. The idea that people are good at different things, and if they specialize, if they focus, they become better and better. And we then get trade and everybody benefits. Now, the difference between him and the Greek philosophers was the Greek philosophers believed that people were born to a station in life. Your father was a shoemaker, you were going to be a shoemaker. You inherited those skills from him, you learned them at his knee, and you carried on with them, and you became really good. For Adam Smith, there's no heritability of these skills and characteristics. For Adam Smith, you choose an occupation that excites you, and then you become really good at it. And he felt that that's habit of specialization in the division of labor was the source of all income and wealth. For him, the only limit to the growth of an economy were the limits that economy placed on specialization in the division of labor. The narrower the definition of the job you do, the better you become at doing it. You may bore yourself silly. This was Karl Marx's comment. That if you go too narrow, and man becomes alienated from the product of his labor, you then have work becoming a necessity instead of a pleasure. And productivity goes down. But for Smith, specialization, the division of labor, was the source of all wealth. In order for it to become meaningful, people had to want to trade. Okay. And trade, international trade, increases the size of the domestic market. You had a market this big, the opportunities for specialization in the division of labor are limited. Double the size of that market, and the opportunities for specialization in the division of labor become that much greater. He's not talking about economies of scale and so on and so forth. He's just saying specialization. So trade increases the market size. That improves quality. This is something that the ancient Greeks had long recognized. Okay, they said if you want to have really good food, go to the king's kitchen, where he's got a specialist pastry chef, a specialist poultry chef, a specialist meat chef, and so on and so forth. Don't just go to someone who's doing the whole lot himself in his backyard. But also the quantity. Then he said, once you have trade, you have opportunities for new technologies. Remember, he was writing at the beginning, right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It only really took off in the 1800s. The Wealth of Nations came out in 1776. Agricultural revolution was well underway. Industrial revolution just starting, but he could see it coming. The worst excesses of it, okay, the social disruptions and so hadn't happened yet. Life in England was still good. But he could see that there were new technologies becoming available, and to make those new technologies work, you needed big enough markets to actually demand the product, and trade could provide that. And England at the moment was starting to dominate the world trade scene. Tomorrow when we look at Friedrich List, we'll see that one of the things that people really resented was English dominance of international trade. And this was because the industrial and agricultural revolutions had kicked off first in England. So it's not surprising that Smith was saying, well, to take advantage of them, we need free trade. Then there's vent for surplus. Now, vent for surplus arguments about international trade are still current. There was a Burmese economist, Leiman, who wrote a piece on vent for surplus models in trade theory, still fairly current. If you have a surplus of goods, what should you do with them? Get rid of them, sell them outside. You have a domestic market. If everything you produce goes into that domestic market, you knock the prices through the floor and you cut your own throat. Take your surplus and get rid of it. Keep your local economy stable and sell the surplus. So what does trade do? It gives a value to their superfluities by exchanging them for something else which may satisfy a part of people's wants and increase their enjoyments. A fairly simple idea, but one that we often dismiss. And then the notion of absolute advantage, all right, which is what we normally associate with Smith. That if a foreign country can give us a commodity better and cheaper than we can make it, well, we'll buy it from them with a portion of our own industry employed in a way which we can do well. So we do what we do best, they do what they do best, and we swap. And everybody's happy. In other words, international trade is no different to domestic trade. I'm a teacher, somebody else is a farmer, I teach his kids, he feeds me, we're both happy. If I had to grow my own veggies and he had to teach his own family, it wouldn't work nearly as well. Well, maybe. So Smith's ideas on trade actually are a little more complex than people give him credit for. And now we come to how did I get to David Ricardo so quickly? Wow. Ricardo is the person everybody associates with trade theory. And his ideas are that little bit more sophisticated than Smith's. Because Ricardo's great insight was that we could have a situation where you can do everything better than me, and still derive benefits from trading with me. I can do nothing as well as you can and still benefit from trade. It's possible for both parties to benefit even though there is no absolute advantage. Okay, how does it work? Well, the simple example is the heart specialist and the motor mechanic. Imagine a heart specialist who is brilliant with his hands. He enjoys tinkering with engines. He is actually a brilliant mechanic. Man is absolutely outstanding. He's the classic polymath. Good surgeon, good mechanic, plays the piano, does everything. You get them. But when his car is giving him trouble, does he fix it himself? Well, if he did, he could be standing at an operating table for the 4 or 5 hours it would take him to sort of gut his car, and he could be gutting a patient at far more lucrative rates. The sensible thing to do. He should be opening up people and not opening up bonnets. It makes financial sense. Even though he can do both jobs better than the mechanic. So he has an absolute advantage as a heart surgeon. He has an absolute advantage as a mechanic. Nonetheless, he employs a mechanic to fix his car. It makes financial sense. That's the basics of comparative advantage. So the idea is that in a two-product world, two countries, one country can be the heart surgeon. It can do everything better. It'll still benefit from importing some of the product of the other state. Now, that being the case, it suggests that not only were the mercantilists slightly wrong, they were completely wrong. He's saying the mercantilist notion that everybody must try and run a trade surplus, missing the point. You could actually all benefit from trading, and the cost of living, if you like, for everyone all around the globe would go down. And here is the essential point. The focus of all of these critiques of mercantilism is on this kind of zero-sum notion. They're all saying, if we trade, we all benefit. We benefit privately as individuals, but we also benefit collectively around the globe. And what we'll see tomorrow is that one of the critiques of this approach, is to say, well, yes, I mean, as individuals, we're all better off. Collectively, around the world, with trade, everyone is better off. But might there be individual countries which are losing out, and individual countries which are gaining? And if individual countries are losing out through trade, through running persistent trade deficits, is the quality of life in those countries going to actually go down in the long run? Should we worry if we're not able to cut it in the world of international trade? Should we worry if we have to rely on capital account inflows to correct our current account outflows? And we just sort of keep on seeing this year after year after year. Does it come back and bite us? Okay, And this, I don't know how I got here so fast. I apologize. This is my last slide. Was this wrong? Now, yesterday I mentioned Keynes. And I said Keynes had this defense of mercantilism where he said increasing the money supply reduces interest rates and stimulates investment. Nice idea. Putting it slightly differently, okay, for those of you who are into the kind of Keynesian macro scene, and for those who aren't, I apologize, but don't lose any sleep. We talk about, in simple Keynesian models, aggregate expenditure. Keynes was all about trying to stimulate demand. If there's a recession, what you want to do is pick demand up and lift it. Now, in a world which is relatively simple, the government can't do much to stimulate consumption. They can rely on sort of falling interest rates a bit to stimulate investment, but they can't actually control it. In a simple world, in a mercantilist world, there was no government expenditure. So our big three, consumption, investment, and government expenditure, were things that were out of control. So what component of total expenditure could the government actually influence? Net exports, X minus M. If they could push exports and curtail imports, then there would be a stimulus to the economy as a whole. That would actually push up the demand side of the economy. So if an economy was in recession and they wanted to stimulate it, the way to stimulate it would be through the trade sector. That was about all that was really available to a government in those days. There was a response from Eli Heckscher. Keynes actually cites Heckscher and says, you know, I got these great ideas from Heckscher, and Heckscher wrote back and said, oh, no, you didn't. Because he said in the 17th century, in the 1600s, unemployment was not what Keynes describes in terms of the trade cycle. It was much more seasonal. It was because so many people were involved in agriculture. You had times of the year when everybody was working and times of the year when they weren't working. And there was an element of it which was also structural, because this was when the migration to cities was starting. It was when the enclosure movements were pushing people off the land for the first time, and they were coming into the cities, and there was structural unemployment. And so Heckscher says this notion can do nothing about those problems. Now, of course, people would nowadays counter and say, well, you know, if you're pushing your export sector, maybe that's a way of getting rid of the structural problems. Okay, it can be a source of growth. But this is an interesting debate that historians of economic thought still sort of punt around a bit. You know, who was right, who was wrong, and so on and so forth. And we've ended, I apologize, I think, yes, 3 minutes early. So, questions? Bradley.
Well, the first question is, I'd love to look it up. Where does Aristotle talk about specialization? Is it in politics, ethics?
Aristotle mostly in the politics, and I can dig up my my references for you, but he has a section where he talks about the emergence of specialization, and he has this piece about a rural village where there are people who are hunting and people who are planting and people who are making equipment and people who sort of make plowshares and so on and so forth, and how gradually the productivity of the group increases. And Plato has really interesting ideas, because Plato's laws are based on the period when Athens was sending out colonies. And he has this question: if everybody is going to be specialized, how many people do we actually need for a viable colony? And if we work on the assumption that there are fixed coefficients, in other words, the number of people doing one job requires a certain number of people doing the next job, so that all the inputs actually match, and the demand, he works it all through, and he comes out with you need 5,040 family units. If you have exactly 5,040 doing all the right jobs, and he's got this mental picture of what the jobs are, then the economy will provide just the supply and just the demand, so that everybody's consumption will be matched by everybody else's production. It's very elegant and way ahead of its time. Leontief got a Nobel Prize for saying much the same thing.
Is that in Republic?
That's in the laws. Yep.
Is there a country that did run trade deficits? Almost indefinitely, but let's say America.
Well, South Africa is doing its level best. Technically, you can't, or you shouldn't be able to. The one interesting case, I suppose, of a country that theoretically could, is the United States. Because the US dollar is an international currency, you have this thing they call the dollar overhang. Technically, the US can carry on pumping dollars into the world economy to pay for its imports. And this is one of the reasons why the Chinese are so envious of the US dollar as an international currency. Yeah, I mean, there are countries that do, but life ain't good. Sooner or later, you have to try and turn it around.
Maybe it feeds into that. It seems, to my understanding, that mercantilists and Smith both agree there should be savings.
Yeah.
How do they understand the waste industrial huge levels of debt?
They would both be scandalized. Smith would be absolutely scandalized by levels of debt like those we have at the moment. In his notion, in order for an economy to grow, people first have to save. Because in his world, bankers didn't really give overdrafts. The modern system of loans, where the bulk of the money in an economy is credit-based. And the proportion of real money, which is not based on debt, in the average economy is tiny. Almost all of our currency in circulation is based on somebody's overdraft. Now, that simply didn't exist in Smith's time. The bankers they existed, but they weren't creating money yet. The fractional reserve system only came into being after Smith. So, we always tell students about the goldsmiths and so on and so forth. Actually, the goldsmith story was only just kicking in at that stage. So he was right. If you want to invest, you first have to save or find someone else who has done.
One final plug for my hero, Keynes,
Mhm.
in his defense of mercantilism. The other thing he pointed out is that and he's writing at stage of 1936, is that the free traders argue that free traders promotes peace, but actually, if we look at the world, they're not doing terribly well, and maybe everyone looking after themselves a little bit might not be so bad for promoting peace.
Yeah, and in fact, when we get to List tomorrow, this was another one of his points, that the essence of economic growth is first to have stability and peace. It's the ultimate prerequisite before you do anything else, and
So why do you think they lose?
it pays. There's nothing like a good, solid, old-fashioned war to get aggregate demand up.
Some more